So thank you everyone for joining us for our first session in our A&R Agent and Ag Educator Safety Training Series. My name is Carolyn Oldham, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education with the Central Appalachian Regional ERC. Essentially, what we do is train occupational health professionals and also engage in research and continuing education. And I'm also part of the Southeast Center for Agricultural Health and Injury Prevention. It's our sister center, so it is also co-sponsoring this session. Brian Schilling is our special speaker today to present on agritourism safety and liability considerations. Brian is the director of Rutgers Cooperative Extension and senior associate director of the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. He holds an academic appointment as extension specialist of agricultural policy in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences at Rutgers University. During his 29 years at the school, much of Schilling's research has focused on New Jersey farm viability, farmland preservation, and agricultural economic development at the urban-rural fringe. We're so happy to have him with us here today. And he has also offered to receive questions as they come up. So as participants have questions, feel free to unmute yourselves. I will be muting you as you come in, just so we don't pick up any dialogue in the background, as I know many are attending at their offices. So without further ado, thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you, Carolyn. Let me advance here. There we go. Well, first of all, this has really been the best part of my day, to step away from administrative issues for a while and get back to the programming type activities that I love to still participate in. And really talking with you today about something very important here in New Jersey and across our region, and indeed nationally. And I wanted to emphasize a word in the title here: agritourism safety and liability considerations. The word considerations was very purposeful, and it became very apparent to me over the last decade or so that a lot of what a university comes out with in terms of best practices or any suggestion that there's a right way and a wrong way to do things is sometimes binding on the grower community. So during COVID, we actually had a difficult time for a stretch having the authorization during quarantine periods to have agritourism operations operate. And I was saying to Carolyn earlier, here in New Jersey, there's a 6-week window that some of our growers might earn 50, 60 or more % of their income. And that's from mid-September through October, the harvest period. So we had some growers that during COVID and many of the economic crises that we've experienced over the last couple of years, really very concerned that they wouldn't be able to operate. So rather than saying there's a one way or other way of doing things properly in agritourism, we adopted the word considerations to give the grower community guidance in terms of the types of issues that they should be considering when it comes to safety and liability, but not necessarily be so prescriptive that they had limited flexibility to do them. Okay, just to acknowledge that some of what I'll be discussing today was funded through past work with our Northeast SARE, as well as my own experiment station. And much of this is work that's been developed over the years with members of our agritourism working group here at Rutgers, that some of whom you see in this photo. And I'll conclude the end of the presentation with this same link. But a lot of the information that I draw from is available, and a lot of supplementary resources are available at this web address here, which is our extension training website for agritourism here in New Jersey. So what I'd like to do is very briefly share with you a little bit of our perspective in New Jersey about agritourism and direct marketing, and then really jump right into the concept of legal liability, where that stems from certain inherent agritourism safety risks that may be present, and then how we may work together with the grower community to manage, never eliminate, but manage those liabilities. So I took a very liberal and broad definition of agritourism for this conversation, which is simply the business of making our farms travel destinations for the public to come for educational or recreational purposes. And I generally tend to look at this as inclusive of on-farm direct marketing. And this is really something, when I started working in this area, probably about 2004 and 5, we had to really put some parameters around what agritourism is. And that in and of itself is actually part of risk management. And I thought I might offer this as a point of interest, and please don't be daunted by this confusing graphic on the right. But some of my colleagues, including Becky Smith, who I believe is down in Mississippi, as well as some of my Northeastern colleagues and Midwestern colleagues, work together to really look at what exactly is agritourism, because there's not a very good conceptual framework for thinking about this. And without dwelling on this too long, we hover around the same categories that we see nationally, things like entertainment and direct sales on the farm, outdoor recreation, educational activities, hospitality, and accommodations. But the reason I point to this, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, is understanding the difference between agritourism, which would be subject to certain protections, maybe under right to farm, or if you have one in your state, a limited liability statute for agritourism. The definitions matter. What does or doesn't qualify for those protections? So what we show here, or there are some things that I think we could all agree on, things like an on-farm farm stand or a U-pick operation, or maybe something where you have some wine selection classes at a winery, things that are really central to the production or marketing of your farm product. But you can start seeing things get a little bit further afield the farther away it gets from the production or marketing of your farm product. And sometimes this is where growers get into some challenges when they try to seek protections under existing statutory frameworks. So I'll invite you to just take a peek at this if you're interested. It's really something to spur discussion that we published in this journal that I show here to the left. But the first step I'm trying to argue is that really understanding what you're doing on a farm, whether it's agritourism, or is it something that might fall a little bit further afield from what might be recognized under some of the key statutes or regulatory frameworks for agritourism? So I'll tell you that about 6 or 7 years ago, my daughter could not come to work with me enough. I was, for whatever reason, visiting a lot of alpaca and llama farms in New Jersey. For whatever reason, that just seemed to be the sector that was really demanding a lot of attention in this area. So she couldn't come to work often enough with me at that time. And one of the things I'll point your attention to is that when we talk about agritourism, we think about selling things maybe on the farm or farm products. And of course, the customer would recognize maybe the variety or the quality of those products on your farm. And this is what I say when I speak more to a grower community. They also, of course, are looking at those activities, the things like the hay rides or the corn mazes or the petting zoos that are this tangible sense of product or service that they're buying. But one of the things that we tell growers all the time is that there's a lot of intangible things that you're selling, knowingly or not, when you engage in agritourism. You're really now in the memories business, the experiences business, right? So you have people that may begin or continue with their holiday traditions. Perhaps it's cutting down a U-pick Christmas tree or U-cut Christmas tree, or going to a farm and picking your turkey. There's also the things that people are going to experience on the farm that are part of product. The friendliness, the knowledgeability of the employees, the effort that they make to ensure that the visitor has a positive experience. The aesthetic and the appeal of the farm. Is it easy to get around if I'm with somebody that might have mobility issues or I'm pushing a baby carriage? But what we're talking about today too is the safety of the farm is a big part of what you have to be mindful of as an agritourism operator. That's absolutely part of the product that one is selling. So here in New Jersey, I'll just say, like elsewhere, the reasons for agritourism often center around generating additional revenue, especially if we're trying to see an expansion of the farm family across generational lines. Maybe it's mom and dad, and now you have an adult child that wants to work their way into the operation. Maybe it's also to smooth out seasonal fluctuations in income. But again, these are common factors. I'll just share with you a brief perspective why it's so important here in New Jersey. Whereas we're a relatively small agricultural state in terms of the value of agricultural products we sell, typically around 40th in the nation, we tend to hover between 8 and 12 in terms of the value of direct marketing and agritourism in our little state. And the reason for that can be shown in this graphic here on the right. If you put a dot in the middle of our state, right around the Princeton area, and go 100 miles out, we have fully about 1/10 of the US population that is very well educated, culturally diverse, and very, very affluent. So this is an activity here in New Jersey that we've really moved into very aggressively over the last 20 or more years. And as such, it's really driven a lot of our extension programming over that same time. So moving to the main topics here, important liability concepts. Number one, when we communicate to the grower community, we always try to convey that, again, much like I emphasized with the use of the word considerations, there's not necessarily always going to be a singular right way or wrong way that people engage in agritourism. Every farm is unique, different safety considerations, different legal liability exposure, et cetera, et cetera. So we always emphasize that we are a consultative, we're trying to bring options to the table, but they need to really be very open and communicative with qualified legal and insurance professionals. So that's one thing that we always emphasize to growers. The other reality, and I found this out firsthand as a board member for a nonprofit that I was on, is that anybody can be sued by anyone else at any time for any reason. And I'll give you a little light reading this evening. Google examples of frivolous lawsuits, and you will see some pretty outlandish examples of lawsuits that have been filed. Everything from somebody who was nauseated by a television show on TV and sued the maker of the show, to, I believe it was Budweiser was once sued by somebody who said they drank a lot of Budweiser, but they never saw the types of young, good-looking people having fun that were always displayed on the television commercials. So again, you can be sued at any time for any reason. I will also say that there's a number of law firms that have really begun taking notice of agritourism and farm accidents and saying, you know, is this an area that lacks regulation and oversight? And particularly over the last 5 years or so, there's been a few high-profile examples of hay rides that have led to, unfortunately, injury or death that have caught regional and national media. And again, people taking notice as to whether or not more oversight needs to be made. All right, so just moving quickly before we get into some of the heart and soul of the discussion, which centers on safety considerations, I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about liability from a legal perspective. And liability is simply your responsibility under the law for either your acts or omissions, the actions that you take or those that you fail to take that may result in somebody receiving injury. And I'm specifically talking about premises more than product. So people coming onto one's farm, what are your actions or lack of actions that might expose you to legal liability? And what's actually quite interesting is the concept of duty of care is, in the eyes of the law, what it is that you owe legally to keep farm visitors safe. And the nature of the duty of care that you owe to farm visitors as a farm operator varies. And some people are actually sometimes surprised to know that even a trespasser on one's property is owed a duty of care. So there's 3 classifications that are often used to pigeonhole trespassers. One is the unknown trespasser. I don't know that they're sneaking across the back 40 at night, or maybe they're going from point A to point B just as a shortcut, and I don't know this. So I don't owe them any particular duty of care, but I got to avoid intentionally harming them. So for example, if I put this bear trap out there, right, one might knowingly assume that somebody could get hurt if they stepped on it. So I need to make sure that I don't put something potentially in the path of a trespasser that could knowingly create harm for that individual. And then if there's known trespassers, there's still a duty of care to warn them of certain hazards. And then kids are a little different. We need to take a reasonable level of care to keep kids safe from their actions. So the bottom line here for a trespasser is one cannot willfully, i.e. on purpose, cause that person harm, nor can they act in a wanton behavior, which basically means that I act with such gross indifference to the well-being of that individual that they may become harmed. Maybe I didn't do it purposefully, but in the eyes of a reasonable person, I really had a callous disregard for their safety, and it could result in their injury. So that sometimes surprises people, and just hold this thought a minute about trespassers. So then another kind of individual that may come onto a farm is called a licensee. They're not there for a business purpose per se, but they may be there as a social guest. Or maybe they're a recreational user that you allow to be on the farm to watch birds, to maybe hike. Perhaps you even allow them to cut firewood without a fee. So that person doesn't have a business relationship per se. And with that individual, you are allowing them to be on your farm that may not otherwise be open to the public, but there's really no business purpose behind that invitation. So for this individual, you need to warn of any kind of non-obvious or hidden hazards. And you need to take a reasonable level of care to keep them safe. And again, you can't willfully or wantonly do something that leads to harm. So there's sort of a little bit of a passive level of care that you need to exercise. Warn against, for example, a mean animal, or perhaps you have to warn of an electric fence, things of this nature. But what I really want to focus on of most importance is when you have a business invitee. This could be somebody who's a customer, an employee, or somebody who's there to provide service at your farm. This person is on your farm for the purpose of transacting business with the, quote, possessor of the land, which we'll come to in a moment. Okay? You owe, in the eyes of the law, the highest duty of care to a business invitee. You can't just warn against or passively take an approach to hope you don't hurt somebody. You actually need to proactively search out, actually discover potential hazards that may be present on your farm. You need to proactively look for these hazards and either eliminate them, mitigate them, or warn against their existence. So eliminating something would be, for example, making sure there's no sharp implements left behind carelessly in an orchard. Mitigating a hazard might be fencing off an area that is potentially harmful for a young child. And of course, warning against hazards could be done through verbal instruction of you or your employees if you're the operator of a farm, or actually through signage. And again, I'll re-extend the invitation that Carolyn extended. Please, I can't see people very well here, but if you do have a question, feel free to please ask. I'd be more than happy to address it. Last point here I'll say is to whom, so who actually owes this duty of care to a farm visitor? And typically it's the, quote, possessor of the land, who has either the possession or control of the land. So that could be the farm operator, including a tenant, or the landowner. So it's a pretty broad net. And then finally, what is negligence? This word is thrown around quite frequently. And negligence is, in the eyes of the law, a failure to exercise the appropriate duty of care that you owe to a visitor on your farm based on what a reasonable person would do in similar circumstances. And if you do act negligently, if it's found, for example, that you did not proactively search out and either remedy or mitigate or warn against a clear and obvious hazard, and I got hurt on your farm, you could well be found liable for compensatory or even punitive financial damages. So I'm going to give you a pop quiz in a moment. So here is myself and a few colleagues when we were doing a site assessment at a local farm. And let's assume for a moment that we were there for the purposes of business. We paid our $5 to go into this nice corn maze. All right. Hold that thought for just a moment. Why is it important to designate areas of the farm that are open to guests and those that are off limits? So let's assume myself and my three colleagues come to this corn maze and we're enjoying the corn maze. Why would it be important for you to, for example, indicate that the barn is off limits or that we can't go swimming in the farm irrigation pond? Any thoughts to that? It's hard for me to see if anyone's trying to respond. I'll just give a moment.
Yeah, I don't see anyone in the chat.
Okay. The reason is that by designating areas of the farm that are, say, open to a visitor versus those that are strictly off limits, means that if I go from that corn maze where I paid my $5 and you allowed me to enjoy myself in that corn maze, and then afterwards I decided that I was going to hop in the farm pond and go swimming, but you had that marked off as off limits, I could very well have gone from a business invitee at your corn maze to a trespasser, somebody who is not authorized to be in your farm pond. So the duty of care that you owe me could change. So whereas you may need to warn against the hazards presented by that farm pond, you would be expected to make sure that the corn maze is as safe and free from hazards as possible, because you invited me there for purposes of commerce as I was a business invitee. And again, any questions, please ask. I'm more than happy to address them. But not hearing any, I'll move on to what we see as some of the key messages that we always try to sit down and communicate when we're talking with farmers about agritourism, and specifically about liability. The first thing that we say is really go into agritourism with your eyes open. I know in the agricultural community, it's common to kind of look over the fence to see what a neighbor is doing and say, maybe that makes sense for me. And what we have seen over time is a number of people do quite well tapping into the agritourism market. Let me see something. Julie, thank you. You asked a question, can off limits be designated with only a barrier? So I will show something momentarily with a farm pond, but I'm going to get to the end of my talk now with a key lesson here, is I really believe about layering oneself in protections. So you may cordon off an area with a fence or other mechanical obstruction saying this is off limits, but I would argue that you should also post it, and when appropriate, even have yourself or employees give verbal command that this part of the farm is off limits. So much like I said earlier, there's really no one best way, and there's certainly no perfect way to protect yourself against and shelter yourself against liability. So what I would recommend is multiple methods for communicating what is and is off limits. And another thing I would do is, if I had an area designated off limits and I had employees, part of my training and my expectations communicated to them would be to make sure that they periodically or routinely monitor those areas to make sure that there's no one there inappropriately. Thank you for the question. So we advise growers to go into agritourism with eyes wide open. If you are a production wholesale type producer, you're used to generations of producing a product and maybe putting it on a truck or bringing it to the to the elevator, that's your business model. But once you start bringing people onto the farm, you have a dramatically different business model. It's a fundamentally different business paradigm. I would say one of the most highest visitations of any farms that I can think of in Central Jersey pulls in about 750,000 people annually to their farm. And I suspect there's one a little bit north of Central Jersey that is probably at least, if not a little bit longer than that. So think about that, hundreds of thousands of people coming onto your farm. It has certainly lifestyle impacts in terms of people coming onto the farm, which is often your residence, but it also requires different skills, and in different employees that have those skills, you have potential regulatory and zoning issues. Very frequently, you will change relationships with neighbors or community issues. Some of the farms that I'm thinking about in New Jersey that are in more suburban areas that are destination farms, there are times of the year during harvest or other special points across the 12 months of the year that fundamentally change local driving patterns in the community because of the volume of people coming in to visit these farms. So you may also need to look at farm organization legally and physically different. Think about it. If you had a farm and you've been farming for a couple of generations, you probably really found a way to organize that farm to maximize the efficiency of what you produce and process on that farm. Now, all of a sudden, you got to think about how to efficiently and safely accommodate people. So you may have to physically modify layouts, legally reorganize differently. So again, all of these things present new risks and liabilities. And rest assured, it's a numbers game. Accidents will happen when you have people coming to the farm. And unfortunately, and I've observed this first and secondhand even more frequently, where people claim an accident has happened. So they're looking for a lawsuit and compensation, but they're making things up fraudulently. So here are some examples that I thought we could discuss in terms of agritourism safety risks. And we always caution growers that despite your best efforts, people visiting your farm may not have grown up on a farm. They might have been generations removed from a farm, so they don't understand the inherent hazards that exist on a farm. They may ignore your instructions, they may trespass, they may encounter just inherently unpredictable weather or terrain. So it's a real eye-opener when you sit down and talk about some of these liabilities. And the number of issues here are many, and I just put a few on the screen here in terms of examples of safety or liability concerns that we counsel growers to consider. And I'll ask you if anybody has any others to add to this, because I have two others that come to mind that I don't put up here. I'll watch chat if anybody wants to type something, or I'll be happy to listen if somebody speaks. And I know A&R people, you're not shy people, so play along. What do you think might be missing from this list? Well, I'll tell you one is, sorry, folks. Oh boy, going in all kinds of directions. One of the things that's not on this list is an excessively large crowd. And I have a good example of a friend of mine who basically had a young couple come from New York City, enjoyed a religious harvest festival or a religious harvest time at his farm. Had a really nice time, bought some products, talked to the farmer a little bit, went home. It was wonderful. Next year, the couple came back with many people from their community. And it really overwhelmed my friend's ability to accommodate the number of people who descended on his farm. So he was really scrambling for parking to make sure that people could safely move across the farm, that he had, to redeploy staff to make sure that people were having a good time and a safe time. And he also unfortunately had some issues where the boundaries of the farm bled into some residential areas, and he had to make amends with some neighbors after the event that were aggrieved because of people coming onto their properties, or there was some litter in some cases, or excess noise. So higher than anticipated crowd volume. But I also have one other thing that's not on this list. Let's see if, Lindy, that is a tough question. The question is, what are suggestions for mitigating overcrowding in the heat of the moment? Well, one of the interesting things that we did see during COVID is time ticketing for things like special events like haunted attractions at farms, or even during the peak of agritourism, time ticketing even to attend on-farm markets. So the problem here is the first time that you experience overcrowding. And honestly, I do not have a great answer for you. I would tell you that a number of growers have learned to predict when some of the peaks and valleys in terms of people coming onto the farm will occur. But in terms of actually dealing with overcrowding in the moment, I would say trying to plan a little bit ahead for a couple different things. One is overflow parking. Some of you may or may not have seen a famous photo of an event over in Pennsylvania where they had overflow parking lot, and basically it was corn stovers cut down, but there was a lot of debris in the field, dried out. And what happens when a hot catalytic converter came into contact with it? You had many cars catch on fire. It was a really very frightening situation. So I would say trying to the extent possible, have some contingencies for emergency overflow parking is a big one. And then in terms of the proper staffing, it's very difficult to predict some of these ebbs and flows in high volume areas, high volume times of the year. So I'm not necessarily sure I would have a good recommendation for how to handle that. It's a challenge. That's why it's on the list here, because I don't have a very good answer. Lindy, I'll get to that point in a moment in terms of some checklists that I think may be of some value or use to you and others. The other thing that comes to mind here is actually experience and familiarity. Being a grower, you probably know the farm like the back of your hand. You could walk across that farm in the middle of the night from one corner to the other and not even trip. You know the inherent hazards of the land. You know kind of the inherent hazards of that farm. So trying to project your experience and familiarity onto others that visit the farm, I've seen it too often, and I think it's a real potential safety concern. So don't rely on, quote, common sense, because it may not be common sense to somebody who lacks the same familiarity or experience that the farmer does. Okay. So here's just a slide I thought you might enjoy. Again, little girl riding on a disc. I can remember doing kind of comparable things when I was a little kid. So again, you know, it might be something that is an activity that a grower feels is not going to be problematic, and it may not be until it is. All right, I want to talk briefly about attractive nuisances. And the idea of an attractive nuisance, somebody asked earlier about restricting, let's say, a farm pond. Notice here a couple different things. One is you have a physical barrier or restriction. You have a danger, no swimming sign. What I realize is cut off here. There's also a buoy and a life-saving pole that's also nearby. So you have multiple different things here to demonstrate your proactivity in trying to mitigate and warn against a potential harm. And the idea of an attractive nuisance is particularly important because it's an inherently hazardous object or condition of the property that one might reasonably expect would attract particularly a child. So for example, farm equipment, a pond, animals, beehives, all of these things you can reasonably predict would be attractive and interesting to a young child. So make it abundantly clear that, to the grower, we always would say, make it abundantly clear that you search out for these types of attractive nuisances, these potential hazards to children, and try to mitigate or warn against these hazards. I'm going to go over the next section somewhat quickly because I'd be happy to provide these slides. And to the previous question, there are some resources that I'll link at the end that I hope you may find to be useful in your work. But generally speaking, we offer some fairly specific advice to our grower community in terms of planning for the safe hosting of visitors on your agritourism farm. And the first one that we always constantly emphasize is your affirmative obligation, the need for you to proactively go out and identify potential hazards. Let me give you an example of a hayride. If you are doing a hayride to bring people out for pumpkin picking or just for a nice ride around the farm, you should obviously traverse that path routinely, inspect the equipment, inspect the path, inspect overhead tree limbs that may fall. Look at any potential hazard that a visitor could encounter. You have an affirmative obligation to do that because of the duty of care owed to a business invitee. As we talked about, designate areas open to the public and those that are not, that are off limits, and look for attractive nuisances. Do this routinely and document it. I'll come back to that point. Documentation is key. Also, if you're going to have something, let's say a tractor ride, you know, a hay ride, or any other activity, have something that is akin to a hazard mitigation strategy. One of the things that we advocate is a plan of operation, which I'll put on the screen momentarily, that shows how you're going to offer this activity in a safe way. Train your employees to be your eyes and ears to help embrace the safety goals of the farm and make sure that people are coming and abiding by the rules and having a good but safe time. Communication with visitors, and then I'm going to touch only briefly on emergency response. So we'll hop right into this. In terms of looking at farm hazards, identifying them, what I always advise a grower to do is to look at your farm through the eyes of someone who is not familiar with farming and not familiar with the inherent risks of farming or your land. have the thought of what hazards might a child encounter. Now, this is very difficult when you're too familiar with something. So this is why we really emphasize the value that we in Extension can play. Invite someone to the growers, we will say, invite us, your Extension professionals, or an emergency responder, or an insurance provider, to walk through the farm with you with these fresh eyes to identify things that may actually be hazardous to your visitors. And inspect your farm regularly. This could be daily before opening, but walk through all areas that could be accessible by your visitors, even those that are off limits. I remember seeing a number of injuries on farms over the years. Some are just pure accidents, but I can think of one instance where a young child was in an orchard and having a nice time running around. And next thing you know, came running back with a pair of lopping shears. Fortunately, the child wasn't hurt, but that was through good fortune, not good planning. And I really talked to the operator and said, this could have gone very, very differently. I talked about charging your employees, farm employees, with being eyes and ears, right? And we'll talk about that momentarily when we get to a little bit more discussion about staff training. But the one thing I can't emphasize enough is documentation. Keeping a log of inspections, keeping a log of efforts that result in your employees or your own actions that result in the farm being safer for your guests. And I'll touch on this more toward the end of the presentation. I talked about plans of operation. A plan of operation is really a simple plan that outlines what activity you're looking to do, identify some potential risks that may be encountered delivering that activity, as well as some strategies to try to reduce those risks. And it's also part of your evidence if you go to court in a lawsuit where you can produce evidence of the efforts that you as a grower undertake to protect the safety of farm visitors. And it doesn't have to be extravagant. I took this from the LSU Ag Center, which I thought was a nice, simple example of a wagon ride. What are some of the risks? The brakes could fail. Maybe you're on an incline. The brakes are insufficient to stop the vehicle, the wagon and the tractor. Maybe there is a detachment. Maybe passengers could fall out of the wagon. Maybe they're not listening to the instructions to remain seated. So then we talk about what are some of the mitigation strategies here that could be used to demonstrate your efforts to reduce safety risks. Well, let's just take a look at a few. So I know A&R folks tend to be very observant people. So this is an immaculate farm, by the way, a gorgeous farm, very well managed, but I see a glaring problem, two glaring problems, and I'll give maybe 10 seconds to see if any of my new colleagues here can identify the concerns that I see. Anyone? I see two. You may even see more. Well,
So
I'll draw your
open door. Yeah, the open door. And then what about the access into the covered area that we have over here too? There's nothing limiting access or a notation.
No, there's always one eagle-eyed person in every audience.
Oh, there you go.
That's actually a good one. I was focusing on the wagon and the tractor, but there too, if this is something that was intended for limited or no public access, it should have been sealed off. But I'd say the big number one issue is there's no barrier here to chain off or otherwise close the gate for the loading ramp. And number two, here's my good friend and colleague, Bill Bamka. And I don't think he's ever met a hitch he didn't like to look at. So it looks like a pretty sturdy hitch, and he's probably fairly satisfied depending on the nature of what's being hauled here. But what he would certainly like to see is a safety chain, as an example. Now, just stop and think, if you are basically in a court, as you'll hear me say toward the end of the presentation, it's a contest of credibility. You're basically trying to defend yourself that you were not negligent, that an accident occurred, but that you took all reasonable precautions. So being able to document even some of these little things, like having a safety chain, which is not a little thing in my opinion, a secondary safety chain here to ensure that if the hitch fails, there won't be a detachment. These are important things that help build your credibility and, quite frankly, build the safety of one's farm. Notice here we have nice, robust, sturdy, graded entrance ramp or steps so that mud or ice can't accumulate. They're sturdy. You have good handholds. Notice the chain here. This would be documentation of the efforts that I made to ensure that I have a safe hayride, as an example. Let's talk about farm animals. So I still wish I knew who took this photo. It's a classic one. A lot of attractions on farms center around animals. It's important to advise our clientele, our grower community, to really consider and establish what they see to be an acceptable level of contact between farm visitors and their animals. So particularly as things like zoonotic disease, things like E. coli, things like animal bites or kicks, all of these things are pretty well documented risks when it comes to animals. So I can tell you that we advise a lot of folks to really consider limiting direct access to animals. In this case, you see a double-walled fence with a feeding chute, so you can see the animals, but you don't necessarily get to be in contact with the animals. It's another safety consideration where if you're doing a plan of operation, specify what you're doing to make sure that you identify proactively the risks and try and attempt to mitigate against them. Here's just a chuckle for an electric fence. There's always somebody who wants to challenge their buddy to see who can hold on longer. Nope, nothing more to say on that one. All right, I talked about educating and training employees. Make sure that employees are properly educated and trained regarding the safety of the farm. They're your eyes and ears. Understand what the plans of operations are. Understand what emergency response procedures are. But also take this as an opportunity to think back to one of the initial slides about what we're selling on agritourism farms. It's the experience. Make sure the employees, the farmers, train their employees to be knowledgeable about the farm and the business. Everything from how long has this farm been here? How many generations? Is there a gas station nearby? I'd like to go get something to eat with my family. Just think about your own experiences in a retail environment. The employee can really make or break a nice experience. And I actually advise, without being bureaucratic, having some sort of staff training every year for new or even returning employees, or refresher training for returning employees. Let me say again, this can be submitted as evidence of your efforts of how you've trained your employees to ensure the safety and well-being of visitors on the farm. I actually know a few farms that have a quote-unquote employee handbook. Some are actually multiple pages, some of them are just a couple pages, but it really defines expectations, values, priorities that the farm operator is conveying to his or her staff. It's all part of the documentation of your efforts for farm safety planning as a grower. I'm moving a little quickly because I do want to try to reserve time for open discussion. In terms of continuing on with farm safety planning, communicating risks and expectations to visitors. I often find that this is a section that draws a lot of discussion and interest. So this takes on many forms. Number one, it could be a staff member sitting on a hayride, advising people of the rules, making sure that they're sitting down. So that's visitor communication. But what I'm really going to focus on for a few moments here is the opportunity, and I drew a few examples here, about communicating expectations to visitors. So a fundamental one is a sign that tells a visitor that they are visiting a working farm and that certain inherent hazards exist. Some signs and some legal frameworks across the states may actually have a statutory reference. We can get into that during the discussion, if you will. Here in New Jersey, we do not have a limited liability agritourism law like some of the southern and Midwestern states have. But some signage may say that there are certain inherent hazards at this working farm, and by entering, you accept these risks and should exercise reasonable caution. We'll talk in a moment more about these types of indemnity efforts. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Part of important visitor communication is defining the rules of the game. What are the rules expected if you're participating in an activity? If you're at a corn maze, there can be no alcohol or illicit substance use. There can be no smoking in the cornfield. There can be no swimming in the farm pond. These areas are off limits. These are permissible areas for you to visit. All of these things, as I'll remind you, are important because it helps to define the quote status of the visitor. Are they trespassing? Or if they're within limit areas, they're a business invitee. Very important stuff here. And this concept of release agreements or indemnification waivers often generates a lot of discussion. So let me be very clear. There is absolutely no 100% protection, no get out of jail free card that's going to work all of the time. So some of these waivers actually are very good, but they do not seek to protect 100% against any liability. It's just an unachievable level of protection, and they'll never protect a farmer against negligence. Let me tell you an example of something that I found to be innovative. A good friend of mine has a little membership card for his pick your own and his orchard. So for $2 or $3, you can buy this card, and it will offer you maybe 50 cents off on strawberries per pound, $1 off per pound for apples, whatever it is, through the different points of the year. On the back, however, it has the rules of the farm, and it actually states this is a working farm, inherent risks exist. By engaging in these activities, you hold the farm harmless. It's an indemnity clause. Very actually savvy way of conveying that information. So even if it's not 100% protection, number one, it's a reality check for people visiting your farms. And states do give some consideration to the strength of these waivers, legally speaking, but you should consult or recommend your farm community consult with an attorney or insurance provider to really maybe get specific language appropriate to the state if there's a statutory framework. But the key element of many of these waivers is the indemnity by user clause, which basically says that I will hold you harmless if I get hurt on your farm as a result of me participating in one of your agritourism activities. Okay. With your permission, I'll just go over this very quickly. The last part of farm safety planning is emergency response procedures. Again, this material will be available to you, but I do want to just draw one or two examples to the forefront. So in terms of emergency response, be prepared, and be prepared before an emergency occurs. Obviously, that's the goal. We really encourage people to invite emergency responders onto the farm. It could be EMS, fire department. Some farms with big visitor expectations actually have seasonal staff that may actually have EMS training on their staff, but have emergency responders toward the farm. As I said, also, third-party persons like extension professionals or insurance providers, just to look through the farm to try to mitigate against certain harms, but also give you some sense of how to respond appropriately if an emergency does take place. It's advisable, and I'm moving quickly, so please excuse me. I do want to draw your attention to something that we strongly advocate, which is an incident response form. I remember seeing somebody coming off of a hay wagon and their knee buckled, and they actually caused a pretty significant injury to their knee and to their ankle. The person was in clear pain. She was very much hurt, but she was embarrassed. She wanted to go home. She declined my friend, the farmer's invitation to provide medical treatment and just wanted to go home. So he wrote something on the back of a business card that he had in his pocket, and that was the end of it. Well, sure enough, more than a year later, the person sued. He had no record of the incident. He vaguely remembered it. He remembered it, but not all the details. He had no documentation. That little business card where I wrote down a few notes was long since lost. So one of the things, and this is one of the resources that I'll link to, is the value of having what is an incident response form. It basically documents an accident or other adverse event on the farm with basic information, the name, contact information of the injured party, and a detailed description of what happened, the time and location, the type of injury or harm that it was incurred, how and why did the incident happen? Was it raining out? Was it muddy? Was it, what were the circumstances? What was the nature of the status of the individual? Were they there as an invited business guest? Were they trespassing? And as I said, what were the farm conditions? All of these details matter. You can describe any medical assistance that was actually provided or offered, and also the names and information for any witnesses. This is now an important record to maintain because it documents the incident in real time and gives and maintains and preserves details that will otherwise be lost. So a few final thoughts. Excuse me. If I didn't say earlier, I'm getting over COVID, so I'm a little hoarse. So please, thank you for your indulgence and excuse the voice. So a few final thoughts. I've alluded to this a few times, but this is really my perspective and my advice in terms of managing liability on the farm. It's very much similar to dressing against the cold, dress in layers. Risks, liability exposure on the farm will always be present whenever you have employees or guests on the farm. I know there's some laws out there that limit a farm operator's liability, but they do not provide 100% protection. And if we had more time, I can give you plenty of examples as to why not. So what we always urge is to add layers of protection. Many of these things we talked about, everything from the farm safety planning to the employee training to the documentation. If you have an accident and if it goes to a lawsuit, it's a contest in credibility. So I would posit that many of the things that we've talked about here are going to help insulate, not entirely, but help insulate a grower, a farm agritourism operator against liability, but never shelter them fully. So just as a few summative things, we didn't get into this today, but think about how the business should be appropriately organized legally. It may be different from a traditional production operation. We went over in some depth about farm safety planning. Also understand and comply with all applicable federal, state, or local laws, regulations, codes, permitting requirements, and also know your affirmative protections. All states have a right to farm law. Some are very strong. In New Jersey, ours are very strong protections for agritourism and direct marketing operations. However, it's predicated on following accepted good agricultural management practices. So you don't have what our Supreme Court has determined as carte blanche. You don't have complete and free protection against, excuse me for one moment, against liability. You also have indemnity laws that are not get out of jail free. You have some level of protection that is a statement of the legislature intent to protect agritourism operators and indemnify them, but they're not shields against negligence. Obviously, talk to your insurance provider, be properly insured, be a good neighbor. Remember the discussion I had a moment ago where we had an overflow of people. We had a very large crowd of people descend on a farm. My friend was out before the sun came up the next day with his spotlight on his head, cleaning up the garbage. He brought apple pies to all the neighbors that had experienced some sort of inconvenience. And just stop and think about how this is managing liability. Good neighbors versus hostile neighbor relations. Where do you think you're more likely to see a lawsuit? Keep good records. And I'll just say here that sometimes keeping partial or sloppy records is worse than no records at all, but have documentation of your safety and emergency response plans, the plans of operation, how you've trained your employees, the inspections of your farms. I even go so far as to recommend that you take photographic or videographic evidence of the farm premises to show the existing state of your farm at a moment in time, admittedly, as well as some of the efforts that you've done to try to keep it safe for your visitors, and maintain a file of any and all incident response forms. So I'll just close with this. Again, the link for this web address here is for our training resources for agritourism development. And to the question earlier, we do have a number of checklists here that are available for download for free. that are, I think, good guides and tools and discussion starters with your grower clientele in terms of everything from animal safety to emergency response to how to train your employees to be effective from a farm safety perspective and all the other things that you see here. We also have a sample incident report form, response form. So again, I do want to reserve at least a little bit of time at the end, so I will stop speaking and I'd be more than happy to take any questions.